Okay, I'll begin. Look, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to give a policy response to these two sort of fascinating pieces of research. And of course, on the topic of intergenerational fairness and equality more generally. There's loads to digest in terms of learning. And actually, Professor Clara Mulder, I just want to comment on your earlier 2000 work on, 2020 from last year on geographic proximity to parents and intergenerational support exchange. And I think it was based in Germany, because I think that reached some really fascinating conclusions there. I'm going to summate this, and I'm sure I'll get this horribly wrong. But what struck me from that research was that financial support, the sort of the bank of mum and dad, if you want, keeps children sort of duty bound, not to migrate almost. And yet emotional support, when you measured it against emotional support, that seems to know no geographic bounds or limits. So I thought that really struck me, in particular to the kind of economic bent on intergenerational work that I take. And thank you also, Professor Lucinda Platt, for presenting just then that research. And you know, it's very worrying to know that egalitarian attitudes are indeed stalling when it comes to gender. It's really, very worrying. But there might actually be some other possible factors sort of driving or influencing this change, which I want to raise now. So to move to my presentation, I want to make a couple of broad points about intergenerational economics. And then I want to make a specific policy suggestion, along with, if I can be so bold, some other ideas for further academic exploration. I'm not obviously an academic myself, so I really, I hope it's taken with a pinch of salt and kindness when I suggest these other ideas for research. Catherine asked me for in the kind of the brief for this, for quick wins, and my sincerest apologies, because there are none. Why? I think because we're dealing with problems, and I'll come to elucidate what these problems are. We're dealing with problems that have taken a generation to arise in the field of intergenerational economics, and they can't therefore be fixed overnight. So that's a real downer. But on the other hand, it's therefore only serious radical revision of our economic basis that will actually change these outcomes. I feel that this proposition actually doesn't need much explanation for those under 40 who might be listening to this talk. There seems, I think, amongst Generation Z, those who come after millennials, and sometimes that line is drawn at the 1995, so those born after 1995. But amongst Generation Z, there seems to be a recognition for the need for radical change. And that's a sort of a very a broad acceptance for that. That's just anecdotally. But let me explain to everyone else why there are no quick wins when it comes to rectifying from an economic basis the intergenerational unfairness we see out there. When we talk about intergenerational issues, we often hone in on a vision of the family, grandparents, parents, children. It's the kind of archetypal intergenerational vision, many generations living side by side. With this framework, it's actually quite hard to envision the kind of, outcomes that we do in fact see. So it's hard to think about Granny, if you want, being mean to her grandchildren, to take the kind of Willits bent that the boomers had been greedy, or in fact, that the Granny was in fact greedy by living, if you want, in an expensive 4-bedroom house, expensive by today's standards, which she may have bought in 1967 for £2,000. And it's hard also to see the economic damage being done by the kind of generosity of parents giving their children a leg up onto the housing ladder, right? So people don't like talking about intergenerational fairness in that context, right, within the family. It grates. So let's not do that. I like not to do it because it doesn't make any sense, but as I said, most people get drawn to that vision first. I want to wrench this vision away from you and ask you to invest in an only slightly more abstract formulation of what intergenerational economics and that kind of framework should be viewed from. As we, and by that I mean our society, put people through the mill of life, education, work, family formulation, building a home, building a community, access to leisure and the environment, eventual retirement, social care, I want us to ask, does life look increasingly better for this generation of 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds than it did for those who came and ran the gauntlet before? Or does it look worse? Does it look better when they run the gauntlet of life, or does it look worse? And some of you may recognize that picture as that board game, The Game of Life, which I did love playing when I was younger, and now I'm doing it for real. It's less enjoyable to some extent. So is the direction of travel that it's easier to form a family, right? Is housing cheaper to buy or to rent? Is education more affordable at the point of use? Out of choice, is it easier than it was in the past to stay in one area and build networks of support, to build up savings, to retire? And by that, I mean to live life longer without the need to work. If you believe it worse, or even not much better, then as a society, we have failed at keeping up an intergenerational compact that has run for roughly 140 years, right? Or actually, at least as far back as our numbers go. Even despite, in fact, war and natural disaster, each generation has, by some measure, improved on these sorts of metrics, but not now. Not now. So this slide, this is from a finding from the Resolution Foundation in 2017. And actually, the year before, I worked on a huge project for The Guardian using the Luxembourg income study data, which reached the same conclusion across actually not just the UK, but a number of Western countries, including the US, Italy, and Spain, and Germany, which was also quite remarkable that sort of there was evidence to show that life in Germany for the current generation was worse than its preceding generations. And so it's safe to say, in fact, that the UK is not alone in this trend by any means. And the effect of people of knowing this, right, knowing that life in the future will be worse, is, I would say, huge in and of itself, right? So leave aside the effects of life actually being worse for the next generation than the one who's come before it. Knowing that the fact that's going to be the case actually has huge effects in and of itself. And this is obviously related to a very simple premise that time works in that unidirectional fashion. And so we now all find ourselves forced into a future that's worse than the present. And this fact attacks the fundamental, and this is a really important point, the fundamental premise of modernity, right? If we believe in modernity, that the future can be better, that the future will be better than the past, then that forward, not back, is where we seek promise. Then this fact that life is in fact economically worse starts to break that compact and break that acceptance of modernity itself. And in fact, the argument has been made by lots of different people of late that this ruptured economic compact has directly given rise to an era of nostalgia, harkening back to the past, and reactionaryism. Let me ask, in a sense, is it any wonder that our politicians talk about making things great again and returning to positions where we once had control? Because if the future is going to be worse than the past, why not go back to what you had? Let's pull back from that more abstracted horror show of a picture. Obviously, Donald Trump is no longer president, so we don't have to quite deal with that anymore, thankfully. And ask what more practical manifestations of this dynamic are we seeing emanate? Well, we know parents have taken an ever increasing role in wealth transmission. Instead of work and investments in assets, such as a pension, being the route to increased overall wealth for a generation. Parents are stepping in and effectively unleveling the playing field. It's not their fault. They want to do nice things for their kids and make sure that they had what they had, that their kids had what they had. But obviously that unlevels, if you want, the playing field and creates unfairness. We've seen in, as I mentioned in Professor Mulder's research, so kind of financial support and emotional support have differing qualitative effects. So as my generation and the ones younger go through their life cycle, we are far more dependent, the evidence seems to show, on parents to generating those pathways to what have been deemed successful markers of adulthood, career, home, long-term relationships, and children. So that's a huge problem. We can, in fact, now see perhaps it's kind of not, that this is now, it's not caused by parents or grandparents. It's caused by the economic system, right? So it's not the fault of parents or grandparents that they're stepping in. That's just, in fact, a reaction to what's going on in the wider economic system. If you want, it's our current system which is immiserating my generation and decreasing those living standards. It's not the parents who lend money to their children to purchase a home or get through university. The game is, in fact, rigged. And I think many people feel that, and that expresses itself in politics in many different ways. And to be a bit more precise in that, the intra-household dynamics create often rational but forced responses to what is going on in the wider economy. So it's policy over the last 30 to 40 years, which is a kind of very dry word, if you want, for saying that the framework of laws and fiscal choices through which our belief systems are realized has a lot to answer for. There's a lot more to explore. So I've got these 2 points to make, one about exploring these other extra academic points potentially, and then my single policy proposal. One is obviously about family formation, and this connects with, I think, Professor Platt's work. I'm not as plugged in as I used to be, but I kind of wonder if there's enough work on the delays to family formation and gender roles, and how men feeling that are unable to support a household because work is more precarious and homes are, in fact, more difficult to purchase or rent, therefore makes this kind of less likely to start one. And as I said, mentioned the rents and house prices and how all these sort of factors all correlate in changing gender roles. Entrepreneurship is a second thing I think needs to be studied. Work is obviously more precarious, and I think you may have seen this in your own work environment. Do companies as a whole become more conservative because workers are less likely to take risks and speak out or kind of offer creative ideas? And creative industries are themselves denuded when rents go up because the opportunity costs of being, let's say, in a band are sort of so much higher, right? Taking when you don't know, you might just, if rents are lower, those opportunity costs are far lower to starting creative enterprises. So there's lots of speculation. I'd love to see more work on this. And finally, impacts on class. Do we increase class divides because of the intergenerational effect? Do you end up with more of a working class because assets are so overinflated? Do we entrench divides because of the bank of mum and dad? There's some work on that, but I think we all know it's a likely effect, but I'd like to see more evidence come out of the data that's already there and being amassed. So new policy ideas. I'll try and be quick because I know I'm really over time. So here's, in a sense, what we shouldn't, I don't want to recommend. Often policy ideas start with and end with tax and spend. But, in my opinion, this won't solve any of these problems except in the smallest ways. Usually people go, oh, well, look, if you're upset about the economic position of granny being wealthier than her grandchildren in their 20s, and just tax granny. Like, no, this is not how we solve this problem. People won't even accept that sort of that response. It's also just pretty lazy and unimaginative. Also, let's not use late 20th century mechanisms for tackling poverty let's not use the sort of late 20th century mechanism for tackling poverty to tackle intergenerational issues. That also, I think, won't work. When the system is rotten and beyond repair, this is also really not a solve. Redistributing money to ease distress is a well-meaning waste of resources in that context. I can put that more bluntly. Giving people £20 uplift in universal credit is really well needed, yes, but actually it's pretty meaningless when rents will go up by £30 next year in the private sector. So it just sort of wipes it all out, right? We're sort of, I think we're spending far too much time chasing our tails and actually not thinking about far more sustainable systemic solutions. Here's my policy idea. It's an ambitious one. Let's build new cities. Currently, we're squeezing in new housing. I think housing is one of the largest problems that we need to solve. We've been talking about it for at least 15 years as one of the big policy issues. It's not got any better, it's got worse. And what we're doing currently is squeezing in new housing into existing infrastructure and communities. What we haven't done, and those communities actually don't like it, right? People become NIMBYs for a reason because they're like, we don't want cheap, shoddy housing in their view squeezed in and making life worse for us in a sense. It actually causes a huge waste of time in obtaining planning consent, and that's actually just pushing up prices overall because we're just not getting the supply in. And all the while, there's a ticking clock, right? The lives of young adults are getting worse. Couples are delaying having children until it, even until it becomes biologically unfeasible. So, and we know that from the stats already. So charter and build new cities around the UK. I would say 10 of them. It's ambitious, it's big, it's bold, all around the country. The time for that is really now. We stopped planning for new cities in about the 1970s. Milton Keynes was the last city or town that we chartered. And that's insane because we've got 10 million more people, mainly older people actually, since then. And it's not just about building more, it's about building in a radically different way. I kind of imagine cities where housing and business space is created using the community land trust models and cooperative rental models, and even more traditionally tried and tested social housing models, and leaving almost no space for straight up private ownership outside of a trust where you separate land and housing. Because that's where the great expense and profits are made. And actually, one of the great tragedies of recent development is that we sold off the Olympic housing legacy in Stratford to Qatar. I mean, that's just nuts. We give ourselves planning consent to build something amazing out of what was Europe's largest refrigerator mountain, and then we sell it off to someone else to make the money out of it, even though we put up all the risks and all the investment and all the capital. We have to think in terms of 30 to 50-year horizons, or even longer, like the Quaker founders of Bourneville, which the picture references, who experimented with rooting capital to ensure amazing and affordable housing outside of the state. It doesn't have to be inside the state, but inside the control of communities. That's what's key. That's what's really key for more than 100 years. I would also, it also allows us to introduce new housing standards, and also build, along the principles that you want to see. It would also bring a halt, this kind of initiative would bring a halt to the need for the bank of mum and dad. It'd undercut the current housing market and drive current prices down, and also drive private rents down, therefore. And actually, it's interesting, Clara's research might question whether people, in fact, move for housing alone. So that's kind of interesting. It's also an amazing social investment and also an amazing financial investment, this kind of scheme. And it will release, undoubtedly, a lot of potential economic energy. And for me, that represents the single best policy initiative. So to conclude, when we've rigged the game and broken an economic compact, which has been a bedrock of modernity itself for nearly a century and a half, you have to think big. You have to think radical. There's no time for fiddling around the edges, and the time to act is now. Thank you very much.